And thanks for this really excellent meeting, which I really appreciate the way it's bringing people together from different disciplines. And Bronwyn started by saying she was an anthropologist, and I was going to start by saying I'm a sociologist, so I'm coming at all this from the perspective of the sociology of science, which to some extent is a bit of a left field perspective. And basically my interests are in the social context which enables certain IP regimes to come about, and also about the effects of those IP regimes on the entities in the world. So in a way it's a kind of sociological, ontological perspective, so I'm glad that Bronwyn also mentioned ontology, because it's something that I think is important. And in terms of the kind of, we were asked to think about how our work relates to issues to do with patent boundaries when thinking about our talks. And I think there's two ways in which what I'm saying relates to patent boundaries. And I think what I want to show is the importance of social norms, values, and organisational arrangements in intellectual property. So I want to kind of extend the bounds of what's normally included in technical discussions of this topic, as I'm sure many of us want to do here today. And slightly more controversially, I perhaps want to suggest that synthetic biology has these kind of deep powers to change the nature of biological entities. So in this sense, it may push at the boundaries of the patent system. More specifically, my aim is to throw light on the interconnections that we see between intellectual property norms, open source aspirations, and the dream of making biology into an engineering discipline which guides synthetic biology. And I want to show how this is linked in turn to a normative and community building agenda. So basically I'm going to have to say a little bit about what synthetic biology is. And I really like this picture, which for me represents the synthetic biologist's kind of view of the world. And to give you a definition of synthetic biology, it's the design and construction of new biological parts, devices and systems, and the redesign of existing ones for useful purposes. The field is a very disparate field. It's very hard to generalise about it, and the strands often don't really talk to each other very much. For the purposes of kind of helping the discussion, I divide it into three approaches. One is what I'm calling the BioBricks approach, which aims to make standardised, interchangeable biological parts, a little bit like Lego bricks, which is an analogy they explicitly use themselves. There's work at the level of whole genomes, and Craig Venter is obviously probably in people's minds at the moment with his synthesis of a bacterial genome, and I put him in this category, along with work which is aimed to synthesise viral genomes from scratch, such as the 1918 flu virus and the polio virus. And finally, there's a category which can be called protocell creation, which is about creating the conditions under which life originated on this planet, creating very simple pre-cells. So this is how I divide up the field of synthetic biology, and I'm personally going to focus most on the BioBricks strand, because I think it's most interesting from an intellectual property rights perspective, although I will talk about Craig Venter's work because I just thought I had to, because he's made this recent kind of big media splash, and I thought I had to say something about him as well. So in terms of the BioBricks approach, there is this desire to design living systems out of these standardised modular interchangeable parts, which is why pictures like this are found often in the field. And this desire is to make biology into an engineering discipline, which is something we see represented in lots of the titles of the review articles that we get in synthetic biology. And in order to do this, we see the use of engineering principles and their application to biological systems in what is considered to be a much more authentic, genuinely engineering way than we saw with genetic engineering. For example, there's the principle of standardisation, and there's lots of discussion of Whitworth's screw threads, which have a standardised thread so that you can use them interchangeably in many different mechanical devices. And the aspiration is to do the same thing in biology. And there's also discussion of plug and play as well. But the engineering principle, which I think is most interesting from the perspective of intellectual property, is the aspiration for modularity. And modularity is the desire to create a functionally discrete unit which retains its properties irrespective of the context in which it's put. So again, this is why Lego is such a good metaphor. It doesn't matter where you put the brick, it still retains the same function. And modularity is represented in the BioBricks school by what's called the registry of standard biological parts, where you can go download the information you need to build your modular standardised biobrick. But modularity is quite heavily contested in biology. one of the questions is, are biological systems actually made up of functional modules, or are they simply best understood as if they were by the engineering approaches that are adopted in synthetic biology? And are modules merely a human invention designed to assist people in engineering very complex systems by ignoring unnecessary details? And at synthetic biology meetings I've been at, there's been lots of discussion and contestation about whether biological systems are or are not modular, and I'd say there's no consensus on this issue. But I think what's really interesting about synthetic biology, that if we find that natural systems are actually a bit messy and interconnected and not really modular, we can just make them modular. And this is a kind of aspiration of synthetic biology, and what it will result in I'm not sure, but again, I'm drawing on Lego as a kind of inspiration. So the thing about modular systems is they're not only easy to engineer, which is why people want to make things modular, they're also very well suited to intellectual property regimes. If you want to patent something, you want it to be bounded, you want it to be something that can easily pass from place to place, to be a commodity. So in applying these engineering principles to biology, synthetic biology is making biology better fit with intellectual property regimes, which isn't really surprising because synthetic biology models itself on manufacturing, around which we saw intellectual property being formed. But what's really interesting about modularity is it also opens novel ways of imagining the organisation of collaborative production. So a modular entity is not only the kind of thing that can be commodified, it's also the kind of thing that different people can work on simultaneously. So it's the kind of thing that's ideally suited to a kind of open source type of working. So what we see here is how this commons-based production model and private appropriation can actually rely on the very same ontological characteristics of living things maybe, or of any entity really. So just to briefly talk a little bit about Craig Venter's recent work in synthetic genomics. You may be aware of the paper he published a couple of months ago where he talked about the creation of a bacterial cell controlled by a chemically synthesized genome. So what he did is he synthesized the genome from scratch. He put it into a recipient cell, which then went on to replicate and divide. And this was heralded as a landmark achievement with great furore. And this is part of a longer-term aspiration to build a kind of minimal chassis into which you could implant other devices and make something useful. And Venter is obviously notorious for vigorously pursuing IP, as we had a discussion earlier about ESTs and his crucial role in that in the early 90s. So it's not really surprising that he has filed many patents on his recent work on synthetic genomics. And he's also watermarked his name as well as the names of his collaborators, as well as apparently some quotations from literature and a web address into the synthetic genome that he's created. And this raises really interesting issues of intellectual property, which I'm not going to talk about because I won't have time to talk about everything else. Just merely to say that some civil society organisations have said that he will become the Microsoft of synthetic biology, and that Venter's work will lead to a dominance of one particular cellular chassis for all future work in the field. So actually what I find interesting about Venter's work is that if you heard him talk about it, you would have heard him use computational metaphors a lot when he was discussing it. He said that the synthetic genome booted up the cell. I think a metaphor that Bronwyn referred to earlier. And he also said that this is the first cell to have its parent be a computer. So it has these really nice use of computational metaphors in his work. And we also see in the paper itself, he talks about how DNA sequencing allows storage of the genetic instructions for life as a digital file. And this, I think, again, is really interesting. A kind of gene centrism, highlighting of the importance of the gene, which we also see in Joe Sweet's recent ruling, where he talks about DNA being the physical embodiment of biological information. So I think there's really interesting similarities between these two examples. And I think if we think that genes have this incredibly important controlling central role, then this is why they've become the focus of patent applications. But philosophers of biology and others have argued that actually this is not accurate, it actually doesn't reflect the importance of cellular context. And the kind of gene centrism of Venter's work dissipates when you read the paper and you read that the synthetic genome will only thrive if it's actually implanted into a recipient cell, which it then takes over. But it needs that context, it needs the the cellular machinery, it needs water, it needs lipids, etc. So now I'm going to move on to my main topic, which is the ownership and sharing of biobricks. But something that it does have very much in common with Venture's work is, again, this use of computational metaphors. And this talk about how DNA sequencing and synthesis technologies make genetic information and material interconvertible, and how these technologies will allow DNA sequences to be what they call decompiled and recompiled. So translated into a genetic sequence and translated into digital form, then recompiled or perhaps even refactored, which is the title of one of the synthetic biology articles in the field, where they refactor a genome and then synthesized again. And so we have this idea that these biobricks can be combined in the same manner that Linux modules are now combined to make software. And so what's interesting here is, again, the strong analogies we see to software, but also that, again, these kind of informational computational metaphors are mobilized by the biobricks approach to talk about an open source, to talk about Linux and these kind of things, whereas for Venture they're used in the service of more proprietary strategies. So it's not enough to just talk about Linux and to talk about open source, you have to kind of do something about it. And what's happened is we've had this thing called the BioBricks Foundation, which has been set up in an attempt to ensure that the information needed to build your biobricks remains in the public domain. And the aim of the BioBricks Foundation is to foster the open design, construction, distribution, understanding and use of BioBricks trademark, I won't talk about that, but that's interesting, compatible parts. And this is the problem, the reason why openness is such an agenda for the field is because synthetic creations are likely to require many different biobricks, so we can get blocking patents, we can have the tragedy of the anti-commons, we can have patent thickets, for example. So the BioBrick Public Agreement is an interesting kind of attempt to establish the grounds on which biobricks could be accessed and shared. And at the moment it's not actually an agreement, it's just open for comments and open for discussion. But if it did come into force, if you signed up to it, you'd get access to all the biobricks in the Registry of Standard Biological Parts, but you would have to promise not to assert any property rights you might hold on biobricks yourself. So what's interesting about this, particularly in the context of discourses of open source, is that it's not viral, which we might have expected. There isn't a share-alike clause. It's not saying that you have to share what you modify on the same terms as what you've taken from the registry. In fact, the patenting is explicitly permitted by the agreement. Parts can be patented if they're in a mixed system, if they're in novel combinations, or if they are inventive. And the reason that patenting is allowed to be in here is because of this aim, which is to enable a rich, fully diverse ecology of commercial and public benefit, quoting from the public agreement. And this, in turn, is inspired by what people talk about as the rich ecosystem of software innovation, where we have proprietary and open strategies happily coexisting, or according to the synthetic biology community, this is something to be aspired to. So what we see is that peer production of biobricks is entirely compatible with the more proprietary strategies. And the BioBricks Public Agreement is not the only suggestion about how biobricks should be owned and shared. There's also alternative models such as Henkel and Moore's embedded Linux, which have been proposed, which talks about you hold something private for 6 months and then you release it. So I'm not saying this is the only suggestion for how to organise intellectual property around biobricks. And if I was a legal scholar now, what I think I would do is I'd try and work out what was the best model and how we should evaluate them. But since I'm not, luckily, I don't have to do that. And instead, what I want to talk about is move into a more kind of sociological direction and ask, well, what are the norms, values, and organisational structures that are being co-constructed with these ownership and sharing regimes that we see being developed in synthetic biology? And hopefully this kind of broadens the conversation of IP into a wide range of topics beyond the bounds of patent law, which I think it kind of escapes these bounds all the time. And I'm going to look briefly at two community building efforts in the field, which is the iGEM competition and do-it-yourself biology. So the iGEM competition stands for the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition, and it takes place every year at MIT. It only involves undergraduate students who have to compete to design the best genetically engineered machine, and it's grown exponentially since it started in 2003. Last year there were 100 teams with 1,000 students competing. But what's really interesting from a sociological perspective about this competition is it's not just to get people to use certain techniques and certain technologies, it's also about building a community which shares certain values about safety, about security, and about open access to the technology. So, and synthetic biologists are quite explicit about this. They say that they want to shape the ideology, values, and culture of the synthetic biology community through the iGEM competition. So teams are rewarded for contributing parts for the registry and also for debugging existing parts. And I think that this shows, as Alan Portage has written, that engineering isn't just a technical activity. It simultaneously builds norms and practices of collaboration into the standardised parts. Because these students, by developing parts that are interchangeable and can be combined with each other, are kind of buying into the ethos of sharing of their parts in doing this technical activity. So I think what this shows is that technology and the social world are being created simultaneously. So this competition has grown exponentially. It's been very successful, but it rests on very shaky intellectual property foundations. And many of the DNA sequences that are in the registry are already covered by intellectual property claims. This is an academic venture at the moment, so it works at the moment. We had discussion earlier about green fluorescent protein. This is something that's used by virtually all the teams, but it has very strong IP on it. And so the kind of threat of litigation hovers in the background of the iGEM competition. And what people in synthetic biology say is they say that iGEM is breaking the existing IP regime. Rather than changing iGEM, what they say is this means that the IP regime is broken itself and needs a fundamental overhaul. So moving on to my second example, which is do-it-yourself biology, and this is very related to the iGEM competition, although separate, because the aspiration is to get more people involved in synthetic biology, to kind of democratise the field. And this is helpful here to think about the relationship with software, that parallels that were drawn to software. Because in software, the distinction between users and developers isn't a sharp one. So if biology is becoming more like software, then it's not really surprising that users can become more involved in various different forms of biohacking. And do-it-yourself biology is enabled partially by technological developments, which means it's become much cheaper and easier to do things like DNA synthesis. But I think more interestingly, it represents a move towards democratisation of synthetic biology and a desire to make it into a technology that is accessible to all. The DIY Bio is a kind of loose global website, basically, and it involves people who meet up in various locations. It's kind of constituted of mainly bio-curious amateurs, some artists, some moonlighting working scientists who do synthetic biology in their normal lives, some bio-entrepreneurs, and some hacker culture uber libertarians. So what's really interesting about synthetic biology is the way it's embraced these various different types of open source approaches, but my question is why, really? And there are many different motivations here. Some are pragmatic, and we can have many arguments about whether open source is actually better for innovation or not, and some people say it is in this field, and I've given some reasons why they say that already. There's also more ideological motivations. They think that openness should be adopted because it's the best way to benefit the world, and that as biological creatures, maybe we should have rights to hack DNA ourselves. There's also this strong ideological support for what Chris Kelty calls the cause of radical openness in this community, and aspirations that hacker culture values like elegant design, creativity, and the sharing of beneficial works for all will spread to biology. So that, again, this kind of merging of different types of cultural aspirations. Many of these obviously borrow very strongly from the aspirations we saw behind the development of the internet. Also, there's an issue of acceptance. The people say that commons-based approaches will address issues of equity, safety, responsibility, and broader acceptance of the technology. And this idea of acceptance is not just about the public saying, okay, you scientists can go ahead and do your work in your ivory towers. It's much kind of deeper than that. Freeman Dyson talks about how in the future parents will be able to reprogram their food and children will design synthetic pets with perhaps a prize for who can hatch the cutest dinosaur, which he talks about in his paper. But I think what we have to understand is this in the context of broader social movements towards openness. And here, the question which arises is, well, what exactly is meant by openness? Because there's many different understandings of openness floating around, many of which are kind of merged together. We have open science, which is in the public domain outside the IP system, and actually biobricks at the moment are outside IP, they're available, they're accessible. We also have open source, which depends on the existence of prior intellectual property rights. So in the case of copyleft, it requires the pre-existence of copyright. And also we have open innovation, much broader kind of aspiration and perhaps a move towards major changes in business models globally. And so in kind of this context of open or distributed innovation, people talk about how we're seeing the shift from the industrial economy to the knowledge economy, a move away from centralised innovation towards something much more distributed, which is more user-centred, which aims to redistribute agency, knowledge and power. And everyone's very familiar of this kind of user-centred innovation in software, but what we also see, as Von Hippel's pointed out, is this innovation in areas like mountain biking and snowboarding and paragliding as well. And so these are very ambitious, broad aspirations for openness. It's kind of represented in this conference, which is going to happen later this month in Berkeley, called Enlightenment 2.0, where synthetic biology will be a very important strand of this conference. And this conference aims for a rapid, radical reboot of the global innovation system for a truly free and open 21st century knowledge economy. And the talk is about how moves towards openness are going to have a disruptive effect on current business models, and how you could get small companies undermining existing platforms and displacing incumbent multinationals. But my point here is that this is also a social move and a social development, and where there is distributive innovation, there's also a normative model of society being performed as well. There's issues about power, there's issues about values which underlie what's going on here. So I'm just going to summarise some of the key points that I've been making here before, just going on to talk about perhaps problems with this agenda. I think it's not feasible or even helpful to try and separate out the legal, technical, social and political aspects of synthetic biology. And synthetic biologists are aware of this. They're aware that the engineering approach to biology is a value system. Some people are going to reject it technically, others are going to reject it morally. And I think we can't just study the novel IP arrangements in this field. We also have to be aware of the new social arrangements that are simultaneously being brought into being. But what's really interesting about these social and normative innovations that are being developed around biobricks is they actually rely on the technical ability to make biology into standardised modular parts. So my question is, what if this technical aspiration isn't successful? What happens then? And this is a problem of the recalcitrance of biology. And there's a paper which came out earlier this year which talks about the 5 hard truths of synthetic biology, about how biology is actually much more complex, much more interconnected, that you can't necessarily think of biology in terms of parts, maybe you should think of it in terms of interactions, and that this could be problematic for synthetic biology. But synthetic biologists, I think, are keenly aware of these difficulties. And they know that they are dealing with entities that reproduce and that evolve, which is something that we're all talking about, I think, in talking about biology and IP. And that the modularity that they aspire to may not be successfully applied to biological entities for these reasons. So my question is, if this engineering approach to biological systems isn't successful, will the parallel with open source also fail? And this should remind us that there are a large array of players in the synthetic biology arena, that there are Craig mentioned, that there are people trying to patent, and not all of these people embrace the open biology agenda. So some synthetic biologists think, rather than moving towards a diverse ecology where we have different types of IP all happily coexisting and supporting each other, we're actually moving towards a tipping point where the field will either remain open or it will be locked up and privately appropriated. And perhaps we could think that this will happen. I mean, powerful multinationals do dominate the biotechnology field, and also small synthetic biology companies. They require venture capital, they require merchant banks to invest in them, and they need to file patents to justify this investment. But the argument I'm going to make here is just the slightly more radical one, is that maybe we're not dealing with biology as we know it. current biotechnology patenting regimes do rest on certain ideas about ontology, about the nature of biological entities. And if synthetic biology is successful, it could radically change these assumptions because it has the ability to change these biological entities. And I think that the informational and software metaphors that are really widely drawn in the field become performative. They become actualized, they become made in making biology. And so I think these metaphors are changing what people believe should be patentable, they're changing the way people do biological research. And I think biology is becoming more like software because we are making it more like software and we have the ability to do this. So my question is that if synthetic biology succeeds, which I think is an empirical question, will we have to radically rethink intellectual property protection in biotechnology? And that's the end.
Thank you very much.
Approach, which is about making things simple, or seem simple. So, parts here and fit together, you have this sort of numerous work pathway, and it all works beautifully, you boot it up, and we go. And yet, sort of, other areas of biology is going the complete opposite way. Synthetic biology, it shows about relationships, about how complex it is, all different layers, interactions. It's a sort of big a sort of ecosystem, and a hierarchy and stuff that's very complicated. So, I mean, this. So we should go sort of get to the grain, which is this just a temporary thing? Is this stuff is going to just go away, or well, maybe not. I mean, what sort of language are biologists going to be talking here? Because it's just feel that way, and they're completely different. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the differences, systems biology aims to actually represent and model biological systems as they are, and synthetic biology aims to build new biological systems. And some synthetic biologists talk about their frustration with the complexity of biology and the annoyance that their models didn't work. So therefore, why don't we just change nature so that the models then do work? I mean, it's a kind of engineering approach to biology. But in terms of its success, there are lots of interactions between the two, and synthetic biologists are aware and they're continually being confronted by the complexity of nature, and there's discussions about how maybe we're going to have to adopt different types of engineering principles than we would in other fields, so that these kind of attempts to kind of move engineering principles across are actually going to have to be more nuanced, have to be more context dependent. Yeah, I don't think they would deny that biology is complicated, but if you can make it simple, then maybe you can just ignore that complexity.
Yeah, well, for as long as you're able to.
Yeah, as long as it works.
Yeah.
I think it's an empirical question in the end.
Yeah.
There's a queue building, but I wonder if I can get one in briefly. The bit that you left out about BioBricks trademark.
Yeah.
Tying back to Bronwyn's talk, there we saw how a kind of ethos of openness nevertheless was dependent on quite strong protection at certain levels, the trademark being part of it. Is there something similar going on here?
Well, I actually kind of not thought about it until Dan's talk and Bronwyn's talk, and I was thinking that there is a trademark mark in my talk, and I probably shouldn't have drawn attention to that because I don't really have an answer, but it's interesting because there are different types of biobrick as well, and there's quite a lot of just interesting discussion about what standards should be adopted for biobrick parts, kind of what sticky ends they should have at the end of them. And so what constitutes a biobrick trademark, or could you just have biobrick compatible parts? So that's my thought on it, but I don't really know more. I should look into that some more.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And then John at the back and John in front.
So I haven't actually understood the argument you're making as to why the intellectual property system doesn't fit the goals of synthetic biology. So,
it does. I mean, that was my point, that the kind of modularisation does fit. Sorry.
But your final, so maybe I misunderstood one of your final conclusions, that we'll have to have a rethink of the system.
Yeah. I mean, it's there is a tension there which you have drawn attention to. But I mean, this modularity works in both directions, so you can either appropriate it or you can make it open source. But if the kind of these strong attempts to build a kind of something analogous to open source in biology do depend on the modularity being successful. So if we are going to go down that path, then we need the engineering approach to be successful. But then others could adopt entirely different appropriation regimes with the same scientific aspirations.
So the follow-on to that is that you said yourselves that the IP system was actually generated all that time ago for manufacturing processes. So why is that now sort of going to hold back the development of biobrick style manufacturing?
Well, I mean, when you have bits that require lots of bits that come together that interact with each other, you have problems with potentially blocking patterns, and so I mean, this is kind of one of the pragmatic arguments about why at this stage of the field you may need open regimes which you could then perhaps pattern when you get more developed devices where you have things which actually perform certain functions, but the kind of building blocks, it would be much more effective for them to be openly available. So you can see parallels drawn here with things like the SLIP Consortium. But yeah, sorry, was that?
And is that what happened historically? That in the early days of any other industrial process, this was necessary?
Well, I think there's others in the audience are much better placed to answer that than me. But what's interesting is the ways in which synthetic biologists draw on certain types of analogies with other fields and say we have to do it like that, and software being one that they refer to a lot, but also other people point out that actually open source software came after the proprietary, so after that was mature. So there's lots of kind of conflicting things going on here.
John and then Bronwyn.
Yeah, it's same line about lessons from history. Not so much software, but from the little I know about the early development of the personal computer, you know, where everything seemed very open to users and to amateurs and so on. I mean, that must be to most of these people a fairly obvious analogy. I mean, how do they use it?
Yeah, I mean,
and how would you use it?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of parallels drawn to hardware as well, and there are some synthetic biology papers which talk about how DNA is like resistors and capacitors, and then you move up, and cells are like computers, and they're very similar in these ways. And then also you have the do-it-yourself biology, people who are kind of trying to develop hardware in a kind of open source manner as well. But yeah, so I think again it's a kind of mixed metaphor.
Sure, I wasn't so much thinking directly of the content, but how you visualise, as it were, the history of these movements. Where, I mean, as far as I know, that was closed down substantially. And is this what at least some people expect? I mean, is this, as it were, just a window of opportunity for free thinkers and for cooperatives? Yeah. Yeah.
No, I think this is why I said there are different motivations for open source approaches. Some people think we kind of need it now pragmatically to speed innovation, and then we will get to a system where we will have more proprietary things, and there are lots of companies in synthetic biology. Whereas others have a stronger, more what I'm calling ideological motivation. So the aspiration is that it won't just be a passing phase, but that it will be a different way of doing biology, which maybe perhaps fits into this different global context, a different way of doing business more generally.
Bronwyn and Tom.
I really enjoyed that, Jane. Just a quick comment and a sort of question, I guess. In relationship to the iGen, project, where you rightly said they used the green fluorescence and so on, and this question of whether or not that actually was, some people thought it was a real challenge to patent. But, holding with what Rebecca said this morning, it seems like, perhaps that's simply being tolerated. Almost like, well, we'll allow these kids to play in the sandpit, Yeah. But when they actually come up with a product that is patentable, then we'll come around knocking on the door, a bit like, the Pinkerton brothers, and then we'll want our slice, as it were. So that's one sort of comment about what's really happening there with allowing apparently these open source relationships to exist, but actually how far that's going to go, I don't know, and I'm not too confident. And the second thing is just really a question or a comment about trademark, which is thinking through what work trademark does for biobricks. And I think it probably does a similar relationship to what I was talking about, the stuff with the mice, which is that I think what it signals is the existence of a relationship between the maker and the product. It doesn't, in answer to Dan's earlier question, about it was made illegal to trademark an organism, right, a living organism. And I actually think what's happening here is that the organism isn't being trademarked. It's, they would say, simply the brand that's being trademarked. And so it's not trademarking the product, it's trademarking a relationship, signalling a relationship, a kind of relationship. And I think, I'm only guessing, but I think that's what the, BioBricks folks are trying to do. They're signalling to the world, we have a certain relationship to our materials. We love them and leave them, if you like. And we want you all to go along with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably definitely exactly what it's doing. But there is also an option for attribution of a BioBrick part, and I think
absolutely
you could perhaps they don't call it watermarking, but you could perhaps use a DNA watermark in the part that you put into the registry as well to identify it. So there's all these interesting...
And that's all reputational, in my view. That's the work that's doing, it's reputational.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
They're saying, we'll let it go, but we want acknowledgement that we were clever enough to make it.
Yeah, and then exactly what you were saying about the GFP, I think that's exactly the case. It happens to be an undergraduate competition, okay, it's getting bigger, but as yet nothing that has been commercialised, so what's the point in pursuing it at the moment?
Okay, time for 3 more questions. Tom was waiting, but Julian has something just on
this looks like a precursor to a certification mark. By saying that the TM means nothing, it's telling people in future we're going to try and register this mark. If they register it as a certification mark, then those who sell a product which meets their certification qualifications can use that mark, so that other people who actually produce things, reagents, can sell them as Joe Blob such and such, which is a BioBrick. And those certification requirements might, for instance, mean that they were open source or not. But this is pure certification mark.
Tom.
Just a small historical parallel. You mentioned patent thickets. Now, in engineering, I believe that during the Second World War, in the context of aircraft production, particularly in the United States, there was a bit of a patent thicket, and the US government imposed a patent pool on aircraft production. And that, it's not open sourcing, but it was getting in that direction within an engineering context.
Yeah, no, I think this is something that I haven't given you the full story of the different options for how to deal with this field, and people are talking about this and they're talking about lots of other options. I went for the one that I considered to be the more sociologically interesting, but yeah, there's definitely talk of that as well.
I don't think it's ever been open source in the engineering industry.
Yeah, that's a good point, particularly since it's so explicitly engineering.
Final question from Dan.
Not a question, just an observation prompted by what Bronwyn said. The Harvard mouse, the so-called oncomouse, is trademarked. DuPont has trademarked it as the oncomouse. So maybe the consistency between the decision that I mentioned this morning in White v. Lovett, that you can't trademark the product, and the trademarking of Jax and then oncomouse and these things, is that basically it's the trademark of a brand name. So you can't sell anything under the same brand name, but you could sell the same mouse if it's not patented.
We'll see what happens with the Microsoft.
Yeah.
So watch that space. But in the meantime, let's thank Jane for a terrific